It was a beautiful dawn over the Pacific island of Midway on Thursday, June 4th, 1942. Two great fleets, one Japanese and one American, steamed to their attack positions. This critical naval and air battle around Midway would decide the course of the war in the Pacific only 6 months into the conflict. Midway would also change the character of naval warfare. From now on, the aircraft carrier, and not the battleship, would dominate the seas. The Japanese and American commanders had already fought a battle in the Coral Sea the month before. Both were convinced long before of the superiority of the aircraft carrier. The Battle of Midway would pit Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto against U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz in a face-off that was the ultimate test of their professional abilities. Japan had gone to war primarily because it needed important raw materials to create a self-sufficient empire. But Japanese leaders realized that the U.S. Pacific Fleet would be their main obstacle. The Japanese therefore planned to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet with a surprise attack against its main base at Pearl Harbor. The attack devastated the U.S. ships anchored in Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese failed to sink U.S. carriers, which were at sea at the time. Over the next few months, the Japanese war machine swept through Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the U.S. islands in the Pacific, and most of the Philippines. By late spring 1942, Japan had largely achieved its aim of creating the Southeast Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as they called their new empire. It seemed that nothing could stop the Japanese from redrawing the Pacific map. The Japanese never intended to invade the United States, but did want to weaken American military strength so it would not threaten their empire. With this in mind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto conceived what he thought was a decisive plan in March 1942. His objective was the island of Midway, America's last remaining outpost west of Pearl Harbor. The commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, had to thwart Yamamoto and remove the growing Japanese threat to America's west coast. Both Isoroku Yamamoto and Chester Nimitz would draw on all their previous naval experience in the momentous clash to follow. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 into a poor family of samurai ancestry. It was inevitable he would adopt a career in the armed forces. He entered the Japanese Naval Academy at 17. In 1905, Yamamoto, now a lieutenant, fought at the Battle of Tsushima against the pride of the Russian Navy. During World War I, Japan was Britain's ally. Yamamoto served at sea for most of the conflict. In 1919, he went to the United States to learn English. He studied at Harvard University. In 1925, Yamamoto became the Japanese naval attaché in Washington, D.C. By 1930, he had become Japan's youngest admiral at age 44. But Yamamoto had controversial ideas regarding naval tactics. He argued against the traditional view that battleships were the masters of naval warfare. Instead, Yamamoto was a strong believer in naval aviation. He argued that it would win future naval battles, and that the Imperial Japanese Navy needed to build a strong force of aircraft carriers. Appointed Naval Vice Minister in 1937, Yamamoto used his ministerial power to push for construction of 2 new aircraft carriers. He also strongly supported the development of the Mitsubishi Zero, a new generation fighter that could be used at both land and at sea. Yamamoto's policies helped ensure that Japan had one of the most powerful navies in the world. But by the mid-1930s, the Japanese Army, not the Navy, had strategic control. The generals were bent on expanding Japanese territory. In 1937, they had annexed Manchuria and began an open war with China. Yamamoto was bitterly opposed to this. He knew it would antagonize both Britain and the United States. The result could be a declaration of war on Japan. He knew enough from his time in the United States that America had enormous industrial might. He believed that any protracted conflict would lead to Japan's ultimate defeat. Yamamoto's outspoken opposition to the Japanese Army's strategy did not harm his career. In August 1939, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. In this capacity, he was given responsibility for planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, Yamamoto put his theories on naval warfare into practice. His use of carriers and attack aircraft against the U.S. Pacific Fleet was devastating and took the United States completely by surprise. Following the success at Pearl Harbor, he argued for rapid expansion of the carrier fleet. He began to develop a plan to destroy U.S. sea power in the Pacific. But Yamamoto would be confronted by another admiral who was equally determined to destroy the Japanese fleet. Born in Texas in 1885, Chester Nimitz grew up in a family with a strong pioneering tradition. At age 16, he entered the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, and was an outstanding student. Nimitz joined the fledgling U.S. submarine service after serving with the surface fleet in the Far East. By 1918, he was a commander and one of the most experienced submariners in the service. As a career officer, Chester Nimitz returned to the surface fleet. He commanded a number of vessels, including 2 cruisers during the 1920s and 30s. During these years, he became a leading supporter of combined naval and air operations. Like Yamamoto, he recognized the growing importance of the aircraft carrier. Nimitz's views were confirmed by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. In its immediate aftermath, President Roosevelt gave Nimitz command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nimitz knew he had a monumental task before him. Not only did he have to largely rebuild the fleet, but he had to do so quickly if the U.S. would have any chance of reversing the Japanese tide. His one advantage was that Yamamoto had failed to destroy the American carriers. Nimitz was determined that these be at the core of the new fleet. Nimitz also believed an attack was the best form of defense. He resolved to strike the Japanese at the earliest possible opportunity. Nimitz recognized the importance of military intelligence. It would help him decide when and where to attack. He also appreciated that the morale of his sailors, shattered by Pearl Harbor, had to be quickly restored. Nimitz did not forget his submariner background. He chose as his first flagship the USS Grayling. He was prepared to rough it like his men. His infectious energy soon energized the entire Pacific Fleet with a will to avenge Pearl Harbor as soon as possible. The time had come for both Nimitz and Yamamoto to complete their plans to seek and destroy each other's fleets. Both men knew the importance of the task at hand. Midway was a crucial observation and early warning post in the Pacific Ocean, some 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The Japanese called it Pearl Harbor's Sentry. Yamamoto believed that Midway was so vital to the United States that a Japanese attack on the island would draw most of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan could then destroy it. To improve the chances of success, Yamamoto wanted to deploy most of the Japanese Navy to guarantee naval superiority. But the Japanese High Command, still under the Army's influence, ordered an additional operation, along with Midway. It required naval support and reduced Yamamoto's strength for Operation MI, the attack on Midway. Japan's troops had already secured the Dutch East Indies and the Northern Solomons. They had also landed on Papua New Guinea. Now, the Japanese army wanted to capture the Papuan capital, Port Moresby, a direct threat to Australia. Yamamoto agreed to loan 3 of his vital carriers to the operation to ensure air support for the landings. In the meantime, Nimitz was already preparing his plan to strike against the Japanese. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers, led by Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, took off from the U.S. aircraft carrier Hornet. The carrier was in the Pacific, 750 miles east of Tokyo. The bombers' objective was the Japanese capital. They struggled into the foul weather and then bombed the heart of the Japanese Empire. Though the damage was slight, the moral effect on Japan was enormous. To Yamamoto, the raid meant that Hirohito, the divine emperor, was personally threatened. Yamamoto resolved that this humiliation must never be repeated. Nimitz now began to use his intelligence sources on the Japanese Navy. The U.S. had developed a secret weapon, codenamed Magic, which deciphered Japanese codes. It gave Nimitz prior warning of the plan to capture Port Moresby. He ordered a task force built around the carriers Yorktown and Lexington to intercept the Japanese assault group in the Coral Sea. On May 4, 1942, U.S. carrier aircraft launched a devastating attack on the Japanese. 1 Japanese carrier was sunk, 1 was severely damaged, and a 3rd had most of its aircraft destroyed. The Port Moresby operation was canceled, and Japanese troops were condemned to a long and arduous campaign in the New Guinea jungle. Plus, Yamamoto lost 3 of his carriers for the Midway attack. The U.S. force also suffered casualties. The Lexington was sunk. The Yorktown was damaged and forced to withdraw. But for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's plans were thwarted. The Doolittle Raid and the Battle of the Coral Sea caused only minor physical damage to the Japanese, but they were critical in shaping Yamamoto's future strategy. Undeterred, the Japanese High Command ordered that the Midway operation proceed. It was scheduled for the beginning of June. But Yamamoto's final plan for Operation MI had become more complex. The Midway force was now split into 4 parts. The crucial element was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's strike force, which would conduct the initial air attacks on Midway. Nagumo's force was built around 4 aircraft carriers. The other carriers were wiped out by America's success in the Coral Sea. Then there were the powerful battleships of the main body, commanded by Yamamoto himself. Admiral Raizo Tanaka led the actual Midway invasion force. He was to be supported by Admiral Nobutake Kondo, with 2 battleships, a light carrier, cruisers, and destroyers. Nagumo and Yamamoto would set sail from Japan's inland sea. Kondo and Tanaka would depart from the Marianas. But Japan would strike its first blow with a deception by Admiral Mishiro Hosogaya. Using a second carrier force, he would set sail from Japan and launch an airstrike against Dutch Harbor on the Aleutian Islands. This was designed to lure Nimitz's carriers north, away from Midway. Once the Aleutian Islands deception force struck, Nagumo would launch an airstrike against Midway to destroy U.S. air power on the ground. The landings were scheduled to take place on June 7, 1942, or N-Day. Nagumo, Yamamoto, and Kondo would simultaneously destroy Nimitz's Pacific Fleet, especially the carriers. But many of Yamamoto's officers already felt that the complexity of the plan increased the risk of failure. They expressed their fears to him. I believed that the operation should be delayed or even canceled. But Yamamoto would not hear of it. He insisted the operation proceed without delay. Unlike his opponent, Yamamoto's intelligence was inaccurate. He was convinced that the carrier Yorktown had been sunk in the Coral Sea. In fact, the Yorktown had managed to return to Pearl Harbor and was undergoing urgent repairs. Yamamoto also assumed that Nimitz's other carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, were still docked at Pearl Harbor after the April Doolittle raid. On the eve of the Midway attack, they had set sail, but Yamamoto failed to detect this. He used submarines to observe U.S. naval activity at Hawaii, but he waited to deploy them until just before the Midway attacks. By that time, Nimitz's force was already out at sea. Not only did Yamamoto have a weaker force than he originally intended, but he also had little idea of the whereabouts of Nimitz's carriers. Yamamoto was convinced that even if they did appear, he could lure them away from Midway and destroy them. Yamamoto did not know that Nimitz, via magic, had the key to the entire Japanese cipher system. The U.S. intelligence staff had broken JN-25, the Japanese Navy's operational code. This provided enough information for Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, commander of the U.S. Navy Combat Intelligence Office on Hawaii, to confirm that the Japanese were planning to attack Midway. Oblivious to this, Yamamoto broadcast a long order to his fleet on May 20th. He used a code that was 3 months old and familiar to the American cryptographers. By the end of May, Nimitz knew exactly where and when Yamamoto was planning to strike. Leaving anchorage on May 27, 1942, the Japanese Combined Fleet set sail for Midway. Yamamoto's fateful journey had begun. Nimitz followed his own plan. He knew that his fleet was smaller than Yamamoto's, but magic gave him an edge over his opponent. He ordered that the carriers Enterprise and Hornet weigh anchor and head for Midway. Meanwhile, Yorktown's captain had estimated that his carrier would need 90 days to repair her Coral Sea damage. Nimitz gave him 72 hours. Yorktown was ready on time. Nimitz told his staff he would risk ignoring Yamamoto's diversionary action in the Aleutians. By the beginning of June 1942, Nimitz's main strike force consisted of Task Force 17, with the carrier Yorktown, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, and Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16, with the carriers Hornet and Enterprise. Midway Island itself was the fourth unsinkable aircraft carrier in Nimitz's plan. The vigilant defenders of Midway did not know they would be supported by the carrier task forces. Security and secrecy were the keys to Nimitz's plan. Nothing could risk compromising the presence of the carriers, which were deploying northeast of Midway. To add to the security, Nimitz used 16 submarines as defensive cover. The main objective for Nimitz was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 4 carriers, which were approaching from the northwest. Given the size of the Japanese force, Nimitz realized he could only win if he located Yamamoto's carriers and attacked them first. With their respective plans now in place, Japanese and American sailors and aviators were heading for the pivotal battle. Both Yamamoto and Nimitz knew the effectiveness of their strategies depended on the experience, determination, and morale of these men. Japan's armed forces had made spectacular progress since the beginning of the war. They had humbled Britain and her Far Eastern colonies, which initially derided Japan's military prowess. But the string of victories had led to victory disease among Japanese servicemen. The sailors, soldiers, and airmen felt Japan was destined to become first in the world. They were imbued with the moral and martial virtues of the samurai. The Japanese Navy had more experience than the Americans and had already developed superior night fighting tactics. This convinced them they would prevail against U.S. forces. This optimism led to Japanese complacency and poor security, already illustrated by Yamamoto's intercepted radio orders about Midway. A Japanese air squadron commander even signaled to his headquarters that he wanted his unit's mail to be delivered to Midway in June. Soon after this, a member of Yamamoto's own staff said that U.S. servicemen had no stomach for fighting and would refuse to leave port. By now, both Japanese and U.S. naval crews had been at sea long enough to appreciate claustrophobic conditions on board their ships. The daily routine was tedious, though physically demanding. Both navies also found it difficult to keep their crews fit to fight in such an environment. A critical problem in naval warfare is locating the enemy. Added to this was the problem of returning to a damaged or sinking carrier. Air crews forced to ditch in the Pacific had only a slim chance of survival, especially given the threat of sharks. U.S. sailors were aware of their relative inexperience compared with the Japanese, but they were now developing skills to overcome this. They were confident they could match Japanese combat experience with their own superior technology and professionalism. The recent events in the Coral Sea had shown them the Japanese were by no means invincible. In the air, the most potent symbol of Japanese military power was the Mitsubishi Zero naval fighter. It proved superior to all Allied airplanes. The Zero's superiority helped Japanese Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers to roam freely against Allied sea and land targets. But Japanese naval air squadrons had been in almost continual action since Pearl Harbor. Many of the more experienced pilots had been killed. Indeed, many of the air crews about to fly against the Americans had no combat experience. On the other side, the U.S. relied on the F-4F Wildcat Navy fighter to oppose the Japanese Zero. Although slower, more bulky, and less maneuverable than the Zero, the Wildcat was a tough aircraft which could tolerate damage. Nimitz's answer to the Japanese Val and Kate were the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber and the TBD-1 Devastator torpedo bomber. The Dauntless, though comparatively old, was one of the best dive bombers of its time. But the aging Devastator was truly obsolete by 1942. It would soon be replaced by a more modern torpedo bomber. Of the hodgepodge of aircraft based on Midway, the most important were the Navy's PBY Catalina long-range flying boats. The Americans met the challenge of flying outdated aircraft with a sense of humor. They named their aircraft flying coffins, vibrators, and hand-me-downs. Overall, though, American servicemen had great respect for their inspirational commander, Chester Nimitz. This gave the air crews and sailors under his command confidence for the battle to come. As dawn approached on June 3rd, both sides knew they were about to take part in a crucial clash of arms. On each side of the horizon, Isoroku Yamamoto and Chester Nimitz began the final countdown for the face-off to come. Early on June 3, 1942, Yamamoto's Midway attack force closed in. Yamamoto signaled his crews that the enemy is unaware of our presence in this area and will remain so until after our initial attacks on the island. Japan's diversionary assault on the Aleutians, codenamed AL, began with attacks on Dutch harbor. But they inflicted only slight damage before fierce U.S. resistance and poor visibility led to a temporary Japanese withdrawal. Later that day, one of the Midway-based Catalina reconnaissance aircraft spotted Admiral Tanaka's invasion force. At the same time, the U.S. carriers Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise met 350 miles northeast of Midway. At dawn on June 4th, B-17 bombers took off from Midway to attack the Japanese invasion force. Despite poor weather, Yamamoto's Strike Force Commander Nagumo also began his part of the plan. His pilots prepared to launch a devastating attack. The target was Midway. "108 aircraft took part in the attack. They caused considerable damage, but the main runway remained serviceable. Many American aircraft escaped unscathed. Nagumo lost 38 aircraft. His returning pilots told him the Midway airfield was still intact. This created a dilemma. Nagumo could order another immediate strike on Midway or launch his planes against the U.S. carriers once they arrived. At that moment, he came under attack from B-17s from Midway. They caused no damage, but convinced Nagumo he must launch another attack on the American base. His air crews began to rearm with bombs. By now, the American carriers knew where Nagumo's force was. Nimitz's Task Force 16 commander, Admiral Spruance, initially planned to get closer before attacking the Japanese carriers. But he decided to use his aircraft to catch Nagumo's planes while they were still on the carrier decks. Spruance launched his TBD Devastators, the obsolete torpedo planes. Then, the dauntless dive bombers took off. 2 waves of TBD's Task Force 16 were followed by a wave from Frank Fletcher's Task Force 17. At 10:05 a.m., they launched a series of heroic but fruitless attacks on the Japanese carriers. 35 of the 41 TBDs were shot down by Zero fighters or anti-aircraft fire. 5 minutes later, Nagumo finally received an accurate report on the position of the U.S. carriers. He immediately canceled the second Midway attack and ordered his planes to rearm with torpedoes so that they could attack Nimitz's carriers. By 10:25 a.m., many of Nagumo's strike aircraft were ready for takeoff. It seemed that Nimitz's gamble was about to fail. Yamamoto's initial attacks on Midway had been thwarted. The first strike of U.S. torpedo bombers had been repulsed, and now both U.S. and Japanese carrier forces had been exposed. Yamamoto seemed poised for a great triumph. Within the next 5 minutes, Nagumo would launch his own planes to overwhelm Nimitz's carrier force. The course of the Pacific War hung in the balance. Everything now depended on Nimitz's dive bombers. On that sunlit morning of June the 4th, 1942, Admiral Nimitz's hopes depended on the 60 dauntless dive bombers closing in on Nagumo's carriers. It soon became clear that the attacks by the U.S. torpedo bombers had not been in vain. Their attacks had forced the Japanese carriers to split up and take evasive action. This delayed the launch of the second wave. They had also forced the Zero fighters that protected the Japanese aircraft carriers down to wave-top height. Third, the Japanese aircraft were bunched on their flight decks as they hastily rearmed to attack Nimitz's carriers. The diversion caused by Nimitz's TBDs enabled U.S. Dauntless squadrons to close in on the Japanese carriers unseen. At 10:27 a.m., bombers from the Yorktown and Enterprise attacked. Untouched by the low-flying Zeros, they released their bombs. The results were devastating and decisive. Within 4 minutes, the carriers Akagi, Soryu, and Kaga had been hit and irreparably damaged. As the American Dauntless bombers flew away, they left almost 2,500 Japanese sailors and naval aircrew dead and 3 carriers sinking. Despite this blow to Yamamoto's fleet, the Japanese were by no means finished. 2 waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes were now launched from the surviving carrier, Hiryu. Their targets were U.S. carriers. Despite a determined defense, some of the Japanese aircraft successfully evaded anti-aircraft fire. Finally, 3 bombs and then 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown. Within half an hour, the American carrier was crippled, but her crew fought heroically to save her and keep her afloat at all costs. The Hiryu now withdrew to the northwest. In retaliation, U.S. dive bombers were launched from the Hornet and the Enterprise. They attacked and fatally damaged the Hiryu. Unaware of these events, Yamamoto remained determined to engage the U.S. fleet. He ordered Nagumo to reverse course and prepare for a night attack. Admiral Raymond Spruant, senior commander of the U.S. carrier force, told Nimitz that the battle was over and that the spearhead of the Japanese strike force had been blunted. Finally, realizing that he had lost his carriers, Yamamoto canceled his attack on Midway. In the early hours of Friday, June the 5th, he ordered his fleet to withdraw. Nimitz's final blow was the sinking of 2 Japanese cruisers, crippled after an earlier collision. There were few survivors. The Yorktown, still afloat, was sunk by a Japanese submarine on June the 7th. But Nimitz had saved Midway. The Japanese High Command and Yamamoto himself realized that his plan to destroy the U.S. carrier force had failed disastrously. Against the odds, Nimitz's carriers had prevailed. Yamamoto had lost 4 carriers and 2 cruisers. Over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, and almost 3,000 men were dead or missing. Nimitz had lost 1 carrier and a destroyer, almost 150 aircraft, and just over 300 men. For him, it was a stunning victory. Yamamoto still continued to direct Pacific operations. But in April of 1943, the U.S. intercepted a coded message that gave an itinerary for Yamamoto's inspection in the Solomon Islands. On April the 18th, his aircraft took off for a visit to a Japanese base. It was shot down by American P-38s over the jungles of Bougainville. The wreckage of his aircraft remains there today. Yamamoto's ashes were returned to Japan for a state funeral. To many Japanese, his death was a portent of impending defeat. It was a sad twist of fate that Yamamoto, who twice attempted to destroy America's power in the Pacific, ultimately fell victim to it. Admiral Chester Nimitz continued to mastermind the Pacific campaign and took maximum advantage of the victory at Midway. He pressed ever closer to the Japanese mainland. By the end of the war, Nimitz realized Yamamoto's nightmare. U.S. naval power grew and ultimately strangled Japan. For his role in the Pacific War, Chester Nimitz was rewarded. Along with General Douglas MacArthur, he signed the document that formalized Japan's surrender. After the war, he returned home a national hero and was appointed Chief of Naval Operations. He later became an advisor to the United Nations on naval matters. He enjoyed an active retirement until his death in 1966. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. It stopped Japan in its tracks and enabled the Allies to take the offensive. Thereafter, the defeat of Japan became inevitable. Midway also established carriers and carrier-borne aircraft as the decisive weapons of modern naval warfare, a role they enjoy even today. For Admiral Yamamoto, it was a fateful and disastrous encounter that led to his country's ultimate defeat. For Chester Nimitz, it was a triumphant and decisive face-off.